We do have a couple corrections courtesy of Mr. Bergman, minor things. If there's any written down that aren't substantive, you're welcome to pass them over. If there's anything we should discuss, we can do that too.
And
Just a couple of spelling errors on that.
yeah, that's, we probably got the same ones. Any, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any comments or discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are passed. You can give that to John as well. The third item is non-agenda items. This is public comment time. If there is anyone in the audience who would like to address the, I can tell I finally got to the right distance because I heard myself. If there's anyone in the audience who'd like to address the commission on a subject that is within our purview and is not on tonight's agenda, we do have time allocated for such requests. Is there anyone who would like to address the commission? There is not. We have 3 public hearings on the agenda. These are public hearings, and we will be taking sworn testimony. So I would ask anyone for any of those 3 hearings who would like to present or comment about the application to the commission, if you would please rise to take an oath. And raise your right hand. Do you swear that the statements you are about to give are the truth? Yes. Thank you. Okay, agenda item number 4 is a public hearing to consider a historic landmark nomination for 415 East Prospect Avenue, the Barthold residence. And Glenn, could you give us a little background?
Certainly. So the story behind this one is relatively straightforward. First, this property has an association with the Camp Meeting Association, so in the original plat of Lake Bluff, in some of these original small lots put together adjacent and in the vicinity of some of our landmarks tonight that are being considered. In fact, I'll try to give you a map real quick. We have one prepared. The other notable part about this is that it's as cited by our architectural survey, it's a great example of French eclectic architecture. As we're going to have book club tonight, and so we'll get to talk a little bit about architecture styles in the village. But there's a drawing in here that basically looks like 415 East Prospect is the quickest way to say it. It's got the cylindrical tower, it's got the half timberings around the tower, it's got the asymmetrical shape, an irregular shape, and so pretty good chance in the view of Susan Benjamin and that crowd that it's certainly significant that it could be contributing to a National Register district. That's the essence of it.
I feel better you couldn't get it.
Yeah. You know, it's you have to look at it before you know which way is up. So these are some of the properties we've been talking about lately down here. We have 400 Ravine is on the agenda tonight, 415 Prospect, what we're talking about right now, 406 and 502 recommended at the HPC's last meeting, still pending before the village board, 419 of course on the agenda tonight, and then 401 previously landmarked. So just for some spatial reference.
That's great.
Cool.
I like the graphic.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
That would be our summary.
Did you have a photograph of that?
I'm sure I can pull that up.
Just so we know what we're looking at. Any questions about the application on the part of the commissioners before I ask the property owner to come forward? None? So would the property owner like to address the commission? And thank you very much for submitting an application on what is certainly a very beautiful and historic property in the village. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. I'm Jenny Barthold, and I'm here to nominate for 15 East Prospect for landmark status. I want to thank Ed Wynn for helping me gather and submit the information on this application. The house at 415 was deemed historically significant by the village 20 years ago because of its architectural style, French eclectic, and its connection to the Lake Bluff Camp Meeting Association. We know that the property was owned by the Camp Meeting Association, lots 5 and 6 in Block 10, and sold to Myra Fowler in 1883. More recent deeds and documents claim that the house was built circa 1920 or circa 1925. There's not a lot of agreement on this. Its architecture is described as French eclectic because of the cylindrical entrance tower, the half timbering, and the overall irregular shape. Just a note here, I'm beginning to suspect that underneath this French eclectic stucco is one of the original small camp cottages. That center section there is exactly the same size, laid out exactly the same way as the house right across the street from me, which is one of the camp cottages. So it lines up perfectly, and if you took off the addition on the west, the addition on the east, and took off the tower, you'd have your 2 up, 2 down, $200, what was it, 2 up, 2 down, 25 feet, $200, whatever, the old little cottages. So I plan to do a little research on that to see. It would be interesting. And if that's the case, then it was Frenchified in 1920 or 1925 and made into this. But I don't know. It's a possibility. My house is small and modest, distinctive rather than distinguished, improved rather than restored. People say it's charming, and I think so too. In my efforts to improve the property while still keeping it old, I have replaced all the windows and installed a sliding glass door into the backyard. I have stopped the leaks in the basement with drainage trenches and sump pump. I have rebuilt the chimney and upgraded the flues. These upgrades and repairs and many more are, I'm sure, all too familiar to those of us who own old houses. I have also spent quite a bit of time and money on the small yard. When I moved in, I found on the kitchen counter blueprints and specs for a garage. These plans were already approved by the village. I ignored them, replacing a swath of asphalt with plants, adding a flagstone patio, and surrounding it with woodland trees and shrubs. I value and take good care of my 6 big oak trees. The outdoor space around my house is as valuable to me as the house itself. I seek landmark status for one reason only. I want to slow or limit, in any way I can, the demolition of old houses in Lake Bluff. Many of these old houses are small, like mine, a quality that our village should value. They provide affordable housing, or at least more affordable housing, than do newer, bigger, showier buildings. They often have lawns and gardens too, not just the foundation fringe of green around their newer, larger neighbors. The village is losing its small houses, its small old houses, and the green spaces around them at an alarming rate. I hope my old house won't become one of those casualties. Thank you for your consideration of 415 East Prospect. I hope that you will recommend my property for landmark status.
Thank you. Any questions from the commissioners?
I have one. How long have you owned the house?
Since 2001.
Thank you.
Can you, yeah, I have a couple questions about the house. I'm really intrigued by the idea that it's a camp meeting house that perhaps in the 1920s got a new suit coat put on in a tower and looks like stucco siding and whatnot.
Yeah.
Can you tell by being down in the basement whether there's different kinds of foundations down there?
I've looked, and I just don't know enough
Okay.
to know what to look for. I couldn't tell. But again, this is just a new idea that I have. I guess
Okay.
looking across the street and seeing like this mirror image of the middle of my house is,
Is there an attic that you can get into?
there's no attic, there's a crawl space,
Okay.
no closets.
Yeah.
Those summer places never had closets because people had steamer trunks.
Well, they didn't own that many clothes also.
Yeah.
I would absolutely love to have an architect or an engineer go over and crawl through the small spots in your
Oh, I
house
love that.
to try and find out if it is a camp meeting house. Because if it is built in the 1880s,
Well, that's when it was bought, 1883. the property.
That's the perfect time for a camp meeting house to be built, and then if it gets a new jacket and tower and suspenders and whatnot, 1920, that's sort of a nice natural evolution of the property. And so I would love to try and learn more about that.
I'd be happy to
Yeah.
do that.
Other comments or questions?
I wondered about that gap in time too, it being bought in the 1880s, but the house was recorded as being built in 1920, so I wondered too, what went on with the property.
I haven't done a really thorough search, but I think I might. I'm getting interested in it.
I think that, well, I know, the application needs some photographs. We talked
Oh.
about this.
Those got lost in the, I was up at my summer cottage when Ed helped me
Yeah.
put it together. I can get those to you.
And it's not for this body. I think the village board would like photographs, and it's for memorializing.
Okay.
And if there are elevations or plans that you have available that are easy, those could be attached to this
Okay.
as well.
Okay.
So I think that's something you can work with Glenn on.
Okay.
We'd like to have that before, assuming we approve, before it would go to the village board. And I also am intrigued with the idea that that might be a remnant, as part of my house is a remnant of an old cottage. So additional research on that would be great. And if you do turn up more information or have some verification or even additional questions, we can always add that to the application to the
Okay, good.
landmark, so that we have all the information that we need. Eventually, this will all get online, along with all the plans, but at least anything you find, it'd be great to add to the record. But for purposes of going to the village board, I think at a minimum, photographs that are easy to take, and then if there are elevations, that would be great. as
Okay. I don't have any plans of the house.
Okay.
Just plat.
well. Just the garage that you decided not to build.
Had to sacrifice that for green space.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. Any member of the audience wish to address the commission on this application? Okay, then our next step is to go through the criteria for landmark designation. I've asked Vice Chair Hunter to walk us through a conversation of criteria. The criteria that we identify will be included in an ordinance, a draft of which we have in front of us, which obviously will be modified based on our discussion. So Bob, if you want to just take us
Sure.
through the points?
Okay, so, as Steve said, this is what we talk about to make the determination, and I will go through the general considerations first. So A, and anybody agree or disagree with these?
Why don't you just summarize it so that our viewing audience knows what we're agreeing or not agreeing on?
All right. Summarize it?
Yeah, or you can read it. if that-
Well, I'm going to read each one of these,
Okay,
but I don't like to do that. All right, I'll read them fast. The structure, building, site, or landscape has significant character, interest, or value as part of the historic, aesthetic, cultural, or architectural characteristics of the village, the state of Illinois, or the United States. Is that a yes or a no?
Yes.
yes?
Yes.
Okay. The structure, building, site, or landscape is closely identified with a person or persons who significantly contributed to the development of the village, the state of Illinois, or the United States. Do we hear a yes or no?
We don't
You
know,
going to
do
keep
we?
score there? You
I'm
keep-
keeping score.
Okay.
Yes or no?
Structure, building, site, or landscape involves notable efforts of, or is the only known example of a work by a master builder, designer, architect, architectural firm, or artist whose individual accomplishments has influenced the development of the village, state of Illinois, or the United States.
No?
I would say no. Unique location or singular physical characteristics of the structure, building, site, or landscape make it an established familiar visual feature.
Absolutely.
The activities associated with the structure, building, site, or landscape make it a current or former focal point of the reference in the village.
Yes.
Yes.
The structure or
No,
building,
then let's talk about that one, because
Okay.
that's relating to activities associated with the building.
Well, it was part of the
Village.
CMA.
So the only connection would be that it was part of the Camp Meeting Association, if we're all comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes?
The structure or building is of type or is associated with a use once common but now rare and is a particularly fine example of utilitarian structure and possesses a high level of integrity or architectural significance.
I don't think that standard applies.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is in an area that has yielded or is likely to yield historically significant information or even prehistoric data.
Well, if we're still looking, if we're going to look into the CMA, possible connection.
So certainly not prehistoric.
Not prehistoric,
Not
but
prehistoric.
certainly,
The property that we recommended last month, we had a yes, one of the properties, we had a yes here because it was on the grounds of the hotel, and there were actually remnants of the hotel found on that site. That wouldn't apply here. So it would be aspirational, I think, to say that this is a reason that we're landmarking it now, since we don't know for sure. So I would say no on this one.
I agree.
I agree.
If we're thinking that there's a camp meeting house inside that,
Then that, there
because
might,
it is aspirational.
it is aspirational.
And
Okay.
Okay, on to architectural significance. The structure, building, site, or landscape represents certain distinguishing characteristics of architecture inherently valuable for the study of a time period, type of property, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials.
I would say no.
I don't think so.
Well, we happen to like the architectural style of the house because it's a French eclectic house. It's one of the few French eclectic houses from the time period, although there is the house at 700 Center Avenue, which is a much larger house, has a tower in front of it. Stones, I believe it has a stone surround around the front door. So that's very much a recognizable style. It was quite popular in its time period. What intrigues me about this house is it's such a tiny little French eclectic house. So,
And there's a photograph in the book you held up before. So I think this applies.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, the structure, building, site, or landscape embodies elements of design, detail, material, or craftsmanship of exceptional quality.
We don't know anything about the quality of the building. It's been around a long time. It's very well maintained,
Design?
well, we're also talking about the elements of design.
and we're talking about the design.
Yeah.
And I think that,
We're just sort of, very happy with the little tower at this point.
yep. Okay,
Yes.
all right.
Structure, building, site, or landscape exemplifies a particular architectural style in terms of detail, material, and workmanship, which has resulted in little or no alteration to its original construction.
To the 1920s construction, right?
Correct.
Okay?
That may change.
That may change, but for the better.
The detail, material, and workmanship of the structure, building, site, or landscape can be valued in and of themselves as reflective of or similar to those of the majority of other visual elements in the area. No.
We missed the two above
Skip
that.
D,
We missed two?
Yeah.
skip D, go to D.
Oh, D. Okay, well, how about the one I just read, so I have to read it again?
Oh, okay, let's do E.
Okay.
I think that's fine not to be checked.
Okay, where was I?
So now go
D?
to the fourth one, yeah, D and E.
D.
Structure, building, site, or landscape is one of the few remaining examples of a particular architectural style and has undergone little or no alteration since its original construction. We did do that.
I think that should be checked. Yeah. Yes?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, tell me what's next now.
The next one.
The next one? That's the one okay.
Contiguous grouping.
E.
The structures, building, site, or landscape is part of a contiguous grouping that has a sense of cohesiveness expressed through a similarity of style characteristics, time period, type of property, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials, and accents the architectural significance of an area. I'm saying
It
no.
appears to be part of a contiguous grouping,
I
if there's a
was
camp
going to-
meeting house in there.
yeah, the
but
CMA.
Boy, we're really reaching at that point.
Yeah,
I think you are. I think,
If it,
I don't-
if it,
I
if
would
it
say
had more of
no.
the camp meeting house characteristics on the front of it to match
Yep.
the house across the street, I'd say yes, but
I agree, but as it is now, I agree.
I don't think we can reach quite that far.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last one under architectural.
the landscape is significant in its own right as landscape architecture, not merely as a complementary setting for structure or group of structures.
no.
No.
Okay, historic
more.
significance, did we finish that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Historic significance, structure, building site, or landscape is an exceptional example of an historic or vernacular style, or is one of the few remaining such properties of its kind in the village.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Structure, building site, or landscape has a strong association with the life or activities of a person or persons who significantly contributed to or participated in historic or cultural events in the United States, the state of Illinois, or the village.
No.
Not that we know of.
I don't think Abe Lincoln was here.
Structure, building, site, or landscape is associated with the organization or group, whether formal or informal, from which persons have significantly contributed or participated in historic or cultural events of the United States, the state of Illinois, or the village.
Absolutely.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is associated with a notable historic event.
No, not that we know.
No.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is associated with an antiquated use due to technological or social advances.
No.
And last but not least, the structure, building, site, or landscape is a monument to or a cemetery of a historic person or persons.
Not that we know of.
Don't think so. So,
Okay,
you got the score, Steve?
we've got the score sheet. If there are any other questions from the commissioners, otherwise, I would entertain a motion to recommend to the village board the landmark designation for 415 East Prospect Avenue with the conditions, with the conditions that have been identified in our discussion.
I will make that motion.
And just to clarify, that means we're going to be striking
General condition 4.
general condition 1G and adding to it the reference to section 2D.
Thank you for keeping us
On the-
straight and narrow.
On the straight and
With-
narrow. Yes,
So you agreed to that?
yes, I agree.
We have a second?
I'll second.
Motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Okay, the order is random. Member Nickel,
Yes.
Member Church,
Aye.
Member Bergman,
Yes.
Co-Chair Hunter,
Aye.
Member Liebolt. Yes. And Member Richardson.
Yes.
Chair Kraus.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yay.
Agenda item number 5 is a public hearing to consider historic landmark nomination for 400 Ravine Avenue, the Caldwell residence. And Glenn, if you could give us a little bit of update there.
Certainly. Just one moment. So this is the Caldwell residence, 400 Ravine Avenue. The application lays out a few planks for historical significance, including the property being part of the original 1836 closed homestead, its association with William Cochran, former village president, as well as the Lake Bluff Camp Meeting Association. So really focusing principally on, again, being part of the association and some of the historic figures that have interacted with the property in the early formation of Lake Bluff.
Any questions from the commissioners? If not, if the property owner would like to address the commission? And thank you for your nomination for, again, a very lovely home.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I first moved to Lake Bluff in the 1980s, and I would walk by this house.
And I would look at it and I'd think, oh, that's the most beautiful old home in the whole town. Love that house so much. Do those people who live there know how lucky they are? And little did I know what the future would bring. So we are here today. It is a lovely old home. It's been renovated on the inside, but the outside looks very much like a photograph. The oldest photograph I have of it is from 1910. And the only change really is that the front steps were about 2 sections over. They were in the middle of the front porch instead of around the side. I think the front door was on the front porch. Now it's around the side. But the rest of the house looks very similar. There's some new siding on it and some new trim. And it was built by one of Lake Bluff's first presidents, Cochran. It was owned, the property was owned before that by another early president of Lake Bluff, and before then, he bought it from the Camp Meeting Association, which bought it from Ben Close. The property was much larger at the time. It also had the Duffy property behind me and the Burkert property, which later was sold, was the Vliet property. And Ella Cochran, who was the president's widow, sold that portion of the property to Vliet, who later endowed his historical collection to create the Lake Bluff History Museum. But it's in a lovely neighborhood, and it sits in on a nice lot overlooking the ravine, and I'd like to believe that the love and attention and money that I put into the house will protect it for another generation, another century, and allow it to remain there overlooking its ravine as it has for the last 100 and how many years. Do you have any questions for me?
I don't have a question, I have a story just like yours. I moved in, and my wife and I moved in the 70s. And one of the first memories I have of this house is, it must have been the first Christmas, walking down the street, it was snowing, and looking at this house. And if you look at the front of the house, there are windows, 3 floors worth of windows, and it looked like there was one humongous tree that was in this house, went all the way up, all 3 stories. And I looked at my wife and said, how in the world did they get that tree in that house? And she went, those are 3 trees, dear. But, so my first memory, wonderful Christmas memory.
I'm actually considering putting some money into it because it's roof. And on the front side of it, there's a bad skylight that's leaking. The roof also is leaking. And there's a new chimney that's just an aluminum pipe that sticks up out of the chimney also. So Jim LeDuc is starting some drawings for me to turn that skylight into another little dormer window like that top one. It would mimic that, and it would have the same diamond pattern scalloped siding on it. And he would encase the bad chimney to make it all one little unit. And I actually have a preliminary drawing of that if you'd like to see it. Here, this is a whole packet, and it's at the very back of it.
We're happy to look at it. Just as a process point for the commissioners, if we would be approving this, it would be as is.
Right.
And then if that would be agreeable, then if you would want to do something to a roof line, that would require a meeting with the commission to discuss.
Understood.
Okay.
I just thought maybe you'd be interested because it is a home that I'm taking care of and
Absolutely.
protecting, and there has been some leaking and water damage, and so while I'm putting on a new roof, I'm going to try to do something else that's going to, again, keep it up and keeping and up with the competition out there.
One of the things that intrigues me about the real estate research that you've done is to get a concept of how big a piece of property this sat on. This house essentially had its own little private park around it. If you think about where the Elmer Vliet house is, the house behind the Elmer Vliet house.
Right, so it originally had, I believe, 400, 407, 401, and 398.
Right. So that's an enormous, he basically had his own little mini Lake Bluff estate, if you will. He owns half a block.
Right. It's possible it also included 410 and 415. But I couldn't find verification of that.
Okay.
I only thought so because I figured if he's going to build a big house on his property, he'd probably center it.
Yeah, and you've documented when that was, even though that wasn't the term that was used, was essentially subdivided, but sold off portions of it, and then,
Do you have any sense of how old the house to the east of you is, 410?
Yeah, I think it's, it predates 1900 also.
Okay,
I'm not positive, but I think it does.
okay.
questions from the commissioners or comments?
I'm just curious how long you've lived there as well.
Since, well, this is 21 years.
Oh, great.
Mhm. I know that because my daughter was born that year. It's an easy question to answer.
Before you lived there, I remember I think a woman, I think her name was Pat. She had a beautiful white dog that played with my black dog every morning, so I got to spend a lot of time in front of that house.
We have no other comments. Any other member of the audience wish to comment?
I just have a question.
Sure.
I'm really intrigued by, and I love the center 3 windows that
Mhm.
go up to that 3rd-story one. How far can you see out of that window? Did he build it to be able to see
Oh,
past the ravine?
yes, there are a couple of overstuffed chairs in that window, and you can look over the ravine and watch the leaves change and the snow fall and the seasons pass. It's my favorite spot.
Is it?
Yes, and I've been told that there are a couple of ghosts who like that spot too.
Any others? I've asked Sherry to take us through the landmark designation criteria. So let's
Okay.
do it.
So for general conditions, the structure, building, site, or landscape has significant character, interest, or value as part of the historic, aesthetic, cultural, or architectural characteristics of the village, the state of Illinois, or the United States.
I would say yes, especially, and it would be perhaps something that we could add to the application in graphic form, is showing how big this estate actually was, because I think that is a very unique part of that property that you can trace it to when there was just one big piece of property there.
So yes?
Yes?
The structure, building, site, or landscape is closely identified with a person or persons who significantly contributed to the development of the village, the state of Illinois, or the United States.
That's a yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Quite a few individuals, plus the Camp Meeting Association connection.
The structure, excuse me, building, site, or landscape involves the notable efforts of, or is the only known example of work by a master builder, designer, architect, architectural firm, or artist whose individual accomplishment has influenced the development of the village, state of Illinois, or the United States.
Not yet, right?
Not that we know.
Not
I don't
yet.
know who built it.
The unique location or singular physical characteristics of structure, building, site, or landscape make it an established or familiar visual feature.
Yes.
Mhm.
Definitely. The activities associated with a structure's building, site, or landscape make it a current or formal focal point of reference in the village.
Haven't documented that.
I think no. The structure or building is of a type or is associated with a use once common but now rare, or is a particularly fine or unique example of a utilitarian structure and possesses a high level of integrity or architectural significance.
No.
I think no.
No?
The structure, building, site, or landscape is in an area that has yielded or is likely to yield historically significant information or even prehistoric data. I would say no to that as well, at this time anyway.
I would agree at this time. So we'll take that out of the draft ordinance as well.
On to the architectural significance. The structure, building, site, or landscape represents certain distinguishing characteristics of architecture inherently valuable for the study of a time period, type of property, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials.
No.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a 1890s style house that is, this type of house is throughout Lake Bluff, big broad front porch on it, second floor over the top of it, and then a dormer on the third floor. I think this is a house that's very distinguishing of being in Lake Bluff, but also being in any other kind of resort community.
Okay.
Everyone agree?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. The structure, building, site, or landscape embodies elements of design, detail, material, or craftsmanship of exceptional quality.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
we could
for
say
pretty
yes.
much the same reason, I would say yes also. in
Very
that
well maintained, yeah.
It has the porch, it has the dormers that we like.
The structure, building, site, or landscape exemplifies a particular architectural style in terms of detail, material, and workmanship, which has resulted in little or no alteration to its original construction.
So definitely,
That's
Yeah,
yes.
that's
Yeah.
definitely.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is one of a few remaining examples of a particular architectural style and has undergone little to no alteration since the original construction. Let's say yes.
Mm-hmm.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is or is part of a contiguous grouping that has a sense of cohesiveness expressed through a similarity of style, characteristics, time period, type of property, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials and accents the architectural significance of an area.
Yes?
Yes.
everyone?
Mm-hmm. I
Okay.
think so. The landscape is significant in its own right as landscape architecture and not merely as a complementary setting for a structure or a group of structures. No,
No.
but I think I skipped one.
Did you skip one? Did you skip one?
Yeah.
Yes, going back one. The detail, material, and workmanship of the structure, building, site, or landscape can be valued in and of themselves as reflective of or similar to those of the majority of other visual elements in the area.
Mhm.
Yes.
Must be something about this group that makes it hard.
Right?
yeah.
You just want to jump right to that last
Yeah.
one. All right, historic significance. The structure, building, site, or landscape is an exceptional example of a historic or vernacular style or is one of the few such remaining properties of its kind in the village. Yes? The structure, building, site, or landscape has a strong association with the life of activities of a person or persons who significantly contributed to or participated in the historic or cultural events of the U.S., the state of Illinois, or the village.
Yes.
Yes? The structure, building, site, or landscape is associated with an organization or group, whether formal or informal, from which persons have significantly contributed to or participated in the historic or cultural events of the United States, the state of Illinois, or the village. Yes? The structure, building, site, or landscape is associated with a notable historic event. I don't know about that one.
Can we relate it to the tabernacle? I don't think they mesh
That's a
up.
stretch.
It is a stretch.
There's another stretch,
Got the ambulance.
the ambulance, yes. The story is that their son-in-law, actually drove the ambulance in World War I? That was donated by the citizens of Lake Bluff. And he took it to France and actually drove it in France for Lake Bluff. And he had just taken out the last patient or wounded and had delivered that man to the hospital, and a bomb dropped and destroyed the ambulance. But it was that ambulance and the number of men from Lake Bluff that went to World War I to fight that earned Lake Bluff the name of most patriotic town in America. It's loosely related to this house, but not directly.
Yeah, that's a great story, and I think the second item under historic significance, where we specifically talk about a strong association with the life or activities of person or persons, I think that fits it better. So I would suggest that the fourth one not be part of the criteria.
Okay,
All agree?
I agree.
Okay.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is associated with an antiquated use due to technological or social advances. Nope.
No.
Nope.
And finally, the structure, building, site, or landscape is a monument to or a cemetery of a historic person or persons. We hope
Not a
not.
cemetery.
There are ghosts in the
There are
house.
ghosts in the house,
Anybody buried in the backyard?
Patsy, I got
not that we know of.
Goldfish.
dogs, cats.
Any additional comments from the commissioners? The petitioner or the audience?
No.
I would entertain a motion to recommend to the village board landmark designation for the property of 400 Ravine Avenue, noting that the draft resolution would need to be amended by omitting section 2F and 3D on page 2.
So moved.
Second?
Second?
Second that.
Motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Random roll call vote, please.
Before we do that, so I had 1G as being omitted, and I had 2F as stated.
Did I get the numbers wrong?
Let me double check that.
Yeah.
I used the numbering on the memo.
So this,
Yeah, so 1G
these
goes-
two are omitted and everything else.
Yeah, so
it's-
2F stays in.
1G
Oh, okay. Got the wrong
and
one.
3D.
Yeah. Just
So
wanted to be
I'll
sure.
let you do this for the next one.
Correct.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
Member Nickel?
Aye.
Member Church?
Aye.
Member Richardson?
Aye.
Member Liebolt?
Aye.
Member Bergman?
Aye.
Co-Chair Hunter?
Aye.
Chair Kraus?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Congratulations. Thank you very much.
It's a beautiful home.
I am so pleased to find this much history of this house. I
Yeah.
think this just
It's great.
Fabulous.
Agenda item number 6, continued significant demolition review for 419 Prospect Avenue. There's no action required of the commission. The demolition review that we've been talking about for the last few months is in place pending the activities of the potential landmark status. Ben is prepared to talk about that if anyone would like more information, but we don't, there's nothing we need to do in terms of the demolition review at this point. Okay. Agenda item number 7 is a public hearing to consider historic landmark nomination for 419 East Prospect Avenue, the Helly residence. This is a nomination that this commission voted last month to move forward, and we have asked Glenn both to introduce the nomination and to act as the representative of the commission in presenting the historic background. So I'll turn the podium over to you.
Certainly, good evening. Much of this, I believe, will be similar to the Historic Preservation Commission. Ed Wynn, as you know, and some other members of the community have played a great part in researching the history of this house and really pulling a lot of this together. Indeed, he presented a bit of this himself last month. And so we wanted to hash over that a little bit more, look a little bit more into to some of the architectural components, and then talk about a couple things we found out about along the way. So this is a photo from the MLS listing for the house here when it was last sold, or perhaps before that. Again, our site context we've been looking at all evening, the two houses to the north, 406 and 502, pending landmark designation from last month's historic preservation meeting. 415 and 400 considered tonight, as is 419. So this cluster of small houses here in this block, part of the original parts of Lake Bluff. Again, 502 being part of the original Hotel Irving, some of our original very narrow camp meeting houses and lots still left to the north of the site. Again, trying to think about the character of this block, of this area. This, and we'll come back to this photo a couple times, is a file photo from the Lake Bluff History Museum. It shows the property after what we believe is an addition that adds to this L plan coming off the back, but without some of the new additions over here, without the new garage. To illustrate that, this is...
I'm sorry, could you go
Sure.
back for a minute? So the record would indicate that the original portion of the house excludes certainly the garage that's not existing there, and also the western, the L portion?
Yes, that's our
And that the rest of
understanding.
it, which essentially is the two-story structure, is the original structure?
Yes, and we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go.
Portico is original?
Not positive, but it would seem that way based on some of the architectural details, and we'll talk about that. So again, a survey of the site. Here, this parcel 2, this 20 feet, was originally in the original plat of this area, vacated at one point, and then lot 1, lot 2, you can see my laser pointer here, lot 3 and lot 4. To illustrate, not sure this is the exact chronology, but we're fairly certain this is the original part of the building. This looks like it has different architectural features. This looks like it has different architectural features, and then I'm not sure if this was built together or in 2 separate instances, but certainly here we're getting into modern architecture and not anything that seems historic. This is siding, this is a deck up top, things of that nature. So the timeline provided in your application, again, our thanks to Edwin for doing the hard work, beating feet, for going through some of the records up at Lake County to put this together. 1844, the president grants about 100 acres to Mr. Close of the Close Brickyard. You've probably heard the name before. In 1851, he's determined by a court to have passed away after, I believe, after he left for California. The property passes to his heirs. One of them, Ben Close, gives 60 acres to Solomon Thatcher. A couple years later, Solomon Thatcher deeds that to the Camp Meeting Association. Around this same time, this area is platted for the first time. 1882, 3 of those lots go to Reverend Jeffries, and then at around the same time, a little later, lot 4 goes to Abner Scranton.
Glenn?
So, yeah.
Glenn, we know why Mr. Close,
Go ahead.
closes with a C, not with a K.
Yeah.
I was
It
gonna
was
make
actually spelled like this in some of the documents.
Yeah.
Okay, I've only seen it with a C.
Yep.
Okay, I sit corrected, so it can be
I had
either
the
way.
very same hesitation.
Okay.
So, and then again, to go back, so lots 1, 2, and 3, and then lot 4, again, emphasizing that some of these moved around a little differently as we're trying to remember the documentation of the site. So as I said at the start, somewhat in jest, somewhat from my own education, we have a little bit of book club tonight, courtesy of the Field Guide to American Houses. I don't pretend to be an architectural student, so if someone's more well-versed, please jump in. This is me trying to make the best of my limited knowledge and some of the resources we have here at the village. So one of the architectural styles cited in the application talks about the Italianate style. You can see this is a prototypical diagram. Some things look familiar. Here they are side by side. Some things not so much. We can see these window crowns with a keystone. We have that element on the original facade of the house. This is the double wide window on that front facade facing Prospect. We do have the the long narrow windows, again with the curved element up top, 2 panes, so very historically Italianate, element. I keep trying to put a little flair on the term. But certainly some things that on first sight you would think are missing. There's no cupola. The roof pitch is relatively moderate. The eaves, there's no brackets. Actually, the eaves overshoot the house by quite a bit, and they're unsupported. You'll see that in a couple photos. And then the entryway, not quite there either. So the application, Edwin's good guess, was that this was perhaps dated to a Gothic revival type of architecture, and that turns out to be, at least I think, to be somewhat true. There is a deviant style, if you would, of this Italianate setup called the front gable roof, which draws from actually the Greek revival style. So about 10%, certainly a couple good examples here in Chicago. This is a pretty good one, again, Chicago, mid-19th century. You can see very similar eave overhanging, similar grouping of windows. Of course, here the doors facing the front. This is a little different. This is the same shape laid on both, so you can see a little bit different roof pitch here, but pretty much the same form going on in both cases. The window style, again, on first glance, maybe doesn't seem to be something associated with this architectural style at first. But if we look, again, to other examples, you can see this is up in Wisconsin. We have this sort of shallow curved element with a keystone here as well. So again, I was surprised. I mean, sometimes I think typically this has been described as sort of a vernacular house, and that's true to some extent, but certainly in the core of the house, the architectural principles, again, as an uneducated eye, seem like they're there. Doorways, as it says here, same shape as the windows, sometimes elaborate, sometimes not, but this is the front entry facing south, facing east. Again, same situation. Porches, small porch. Porch supports square post, corners beveled, square post, corners beveled. Belt course present on these typical structures. We have the belt course. It's even carried over onto that addition, which we'll go back into. And so we have what seems to be a pretty architecturally sound core, perhaps. The additions range from good to not so good. This second addition has been with the house for some time, as far back as we could, I could locate, at least in our original searches. And on its first glance, I think, again, as Edwin pointed out, looks like it's a contiguous part of the house. Certainly tries to capture some of the same elements: wide window, arched element, wide window, arched element. If you come in a little closer, well, those aren't quite the same. Certainly a very different style trying to pull it off. Complementary, but I would say this is clearly an imitation, unfortunately. And stepping back here, looking at the top story, here we have nothing going on over the windows. The window, the top edge, no shape, just goes right up to the roof line. So here they are in comparison. There's no space here. There's none of this going on. It's just a fairly regular residential window. And then, of course, this siding, the garage, this addition back here, very different from what we've seen over here. At least back here we have what appears to be a historically sensitive change, still probably fairly old on its own. So again, comparing to what we have at the History Museum, red roof, this L form here, nothing going on here, to where we are today. Mr. Helly did invite us out to the site for a visit. Under the circumstances, we thought it would be easier for staff to go and do that instead of trying to organize a public meeting there and coming back and doing all that. So I went out there, as did our building commissioner, Mike Croak, who's also the liaison to the Architectural Board of Review. These are some of the things we saw or were pointed out to us that we thought were notable. This is the back of the house. Again, another addition you can see here. We're plainly into siding again, not really architecturally significant windows or details. This is fairly standard. Here in the house, Bob pointed out to us that there's starting to be some separation in a few places, cracks in the floorboards, separation between the floor and the floorboard. Here, about 7/8 of an inch to an inch. Again, probably not uncommon for a house of this age, but as I think he'll address when we think about restoring this, what does that signal? Not sure. Here again, similar concerns. These are the windowsills. You can see that there's one big crack that runs through here from settling. Again, big crack runs all the way through, as far as we can tell, but generally in good shape. Same thing, another one of the original windowsills, big crack here, runs all the way through, but again, the window itself seems to be, okay, but what is this signal, and we'll let Mr. Helly speak to that. Some water damage in one of the interior rooms. Again, these things happen, unfortunate. And then segueing into kind of an interesting question that's been out there while this house has been talked about, some of the brickwork. There's been some thought that this brickwork may date back to the closed brickyard, which used to occupy a large part of town. This is from the outside, where there's, as you can see, a pretty big chip or hole, whatever you would call it. In the exterior wall, you can see the red brick through there. Closed brick traditionally is thought to be a yellow or a pale brick, although we'll talk about that. Here in the basement, we have a few photos from here. I did not bring the good camera to this particular shoot, so you'll forgive the quality. Even though the lighting's a bit off, this appears from where we were standing to be a red brick. This is looking through a crawl space in the original part of the building from a dugout basement. And so, constrained space. This is a couple feet high to work with. Here again, we can see some attempts to kind of prop up the floors here, prop up these joists, prop up this foundation with some improvised supports, let's say. So again, I think Mr. Helly expressed to us while we were there what this means for the ability to renovate that or to build around this. I do want to point out, while we were there was a wall that appeared to have been chiseled out just to make room in the basement or to make room for some of this furnace and ducting work. And so we did see some pale brick or yellow brick in this location. I do want to point out as well, Ed provided an email courtesy of Nan Caldwell that looks at a couple structures in town known to be produced with closed brick. So one is a house at Maple in Washington, from which I believe are drawn these photos, which show a mixture of red and yellow brick. The old Village Market, again, different mortaring and so forth. You can see a mixture of red and yellow brick. And so the idea of, is this a Chicago common brick? Is this closed brick? From where does this brick come from? Not really sure. Edward Deegan, our architect representing Mr. Helly, has enclosed a letter saying that what we see here is consistent with Chicago common. Again, hard to say one way or the other from what we know today, except from what the evidence we've provided here to you. And then finally, just to note it as a last photo of our little side adventure. This is, I believe, in a newer part of the house. Mr. Helly, you might have to correct me here, but we can see a different type of construction going on here with the woodwork crossing over, but still this same stucco type material. So hopefully not too boring one to draw your attention to some of the interesting architectural details here. The application asserts at a high level that these architectural details of the original house are unique in the village, certainly are a part of the village's architectural history, that the open form of the lot, and I'll go all the way back to the front here, that this open form of the lot with a small backyard with a large front yard is distinct, that this house may have faced towards the tabernacle at one point as part of the Camp Meeting Association, and as we talked about, the association with all these different relatively notable figures in the village's history and development as we go forward. So that would be our application.
Questions of Glenn?
Glenn, do you know how accurate that brick is that you looked at in, you said the Village Market, and also I would assume it's 666 Maple that you looked at, Maple in Washington?
Sure. Those photos were provided, I believe, by Nan Caldwell by way of Ed Wynn, so we didn't look at these personally.
Okay. Do we have, in the museum, do we have any of the actual closed brick? I'm just curious, because I know someone who built on the site of what was the brickyard, and in digging out the foundation of that house, dug up some bricks. I would assume they still have them if they didn't.
I believe that, Janet, do you want to?
Just to comment that we had a brick at the museum for many years, and it was one of the yellower bricks, and someone had told us that it was a closed brick. Now, what happens sometimes at the museum is things go missing, and this brick has been missing now for well over a year. So I really don't know, and I don't know who supplied the information that it was a yellow brick.
So for our television audience, so the answer to the question is that no, the History Museum does not have an example of a closed brick. Yeah, if we could use, that's great, thank you, Jim. Nan, did you want?
Yeah, if you would.
To the brick, the closed brick, in the history book written by Elmer Fleet, and he said that it had been closed, or was it his brother, built the house on Washington Avenue with the closed brick, and also it was closed brick that was used to build the Village Market. I can find the page numbers of that book.
I actually have a copy right here, and same passage. I think it has a photo of the old Village Market in there, but hard for me to say much else from at least the research I've done in preparing this.
Other questions from the commissioners?
Just for clarification, all of these are from the 666 Maple, or one of these is also from the?
The 666 Maple, and the two on the right are the Village Market.
These are the Village Market, okay, and that's 666? Okay, and that's now an interior wall?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking that because there's a considerable greater amount of wear on these bricks here. A lot more weathering that's occurred, so.
Question. So Glenn, whether or not the closed brick were used to build the house, we believe that Ben Close built the home, is that correct? Because of the price of how much the,
Yeah, that's the assertion that was made in the application. Yeah, that essentially the selling price for these 3 lots was high enough. It seems fair to reason that there would have to be a house on it to justify that sales price.
Other clarifying questions? Thank you, Glenn. Mr. Helly, would you? Appreciate your comments.
Just plug that right in.
Yeah, just plug it right in.
I don't want to mess with that. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. I got a speaker case. My turn to do this.
We're here going, like, how many government employees?
It's in.
did it go?
Yeah, you have to start this to your computer. I'm not messing with it.
Do not disturb.
Okay.
So we have to start with a couple of clarifications. We've read, pardon me, I don't mean to be.
Would you please use the microphone?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. We'll have to start with a couple of clarifications. We read through the meeting minutes from last month, and I think there's at least one significant error that we'd like to point out. And so we kind of need to start with the basics. This is the camp meeting map. We're talking about Block 10, lots 1 through 4. Thank you. There's a detail of it. It's hard to read, or impossible to read on this screen, but these notes are the end lots are 30 feet, the interior lots are 25. The point of that is lots, also, as you note, lots 1, 2, 3, 4. Those lots are the same lots 1, 2, 3, 4 as shown on our survey. 1, 2, 3, 4. 30 feet, 25 feet, 25 feet, 25 feet. As was noted in the meeting minutes, the committee has been informed that the original house was built on lots 2 and 3. The original house was actually built on lots 3 and 4. While that may seem like a distinction without a difference, I think it's critical to some of our understanding of the relationship of this house and the Close family. So, just to clarify, again, make it a little bit clearer, a little bit easier to see, this is the original masonry house, crossing between 3 and 4, and not on 2 or 1. And with that, I'll turn, I'm joined, pardon me, I'm joined.
Introduce myself.
Oh, okay. Well, then you do.
Sorry. I'm Ellen Lay, Bob's wife. And so I did some research, and I have to tell you, as much as I don't want to go through this process, it was a wonderful process for me. I grew up in Waukegan, kind of neighbors, but to be able to delve into the history of Lake Bluff was wonderful. I probably know more than some people now. And we don't want to disturb history, but we also want to make sure the history that we're preserving is accurate. And so in my research, one of the first things that we noted was the crossing of the house on the two lots. And so Edward Wynn had done a good amount of research on purchases and sale of the lots from the camp meeting. And when we noticed that 3 and 4 are, that the home straddles 3 and 4, when I was looking through the research of the lot sales, Jeffries purchased lots 1, 2, and 3 in 1882, and that was November of 1882, and Scranton purchased lot 4 a month later in December of 82. And I think it begs to question how someone would purchase the home that is occupying 2 lots. I further looked into the purchase and sale of the lot. Lot 4 was then sold by Scranton in August, I believe, of 83. So again, if there was some sort of negotiation at some point, the lot then being sold, lot 4 being sold, 8 months later, it was purchased for $100, sold for $175. It doesn't make sense to us that the home was actually there when the camp subdivided all of the lots, and I don't know how it could be there. Anyway, I'm not a really good public speaker. The point I'd like to make is that it wasn't built by close. And so there are some more transactions, and I'm going to get to the screen, on the purchase and sale of those lots. So in 82 is where we had the purchase of 1, 2, and 3, and also lot 4. In 1883, the sale of lot 4 to Partridge. In October of 1887, Jeffries sold his 3 lots, I apologize, just lot 3 to Partridge. So in 87 is where we get common ownership of lot 3 and 4. Perhaps the home was built at that point, but it does postdate the owning, for close to own it. I further researched and found that Jeffries in 1908 deeded lots 1 and 2 to an Ella Brown for $1. And then in 1912, Ella Brown and her husband then purchased from Partridge lot 3 and 4 for a significant difference in price of $17.50. So one of the biggest factors that we want to point out is the likelihood that there was a home on that lot in 1875 when Close sold the 60 acres to Thatcher is hard to prove. There's other distinctions about the property, and Reverend Edward Jeffries and his tie to the camp meetings. I've listened tonight that the fact that homes are built on these lots then tie them to an historic value or at least designation, and given the property's purchasing and selling over the years from the time the camp began and after, the transactions were all over the place. The cost of the lots varied more often than not. They were $100 for a lot. But to say something is going to be designated as historic because it is a lot that was included in that plot, to me, seems to be a stretch. So I think that's about all I'm going to say.
Thank you.
So I think the key of what we're trying to say is it's highly unlikely that there was a house on this site in 1870 or 1875. It seems well nigh impossible that it would be there before 1887, when the two lots came under common ownership. And given that there's no indication of any access to Prospect at any time, and very mature trees in front of the house, we think it's much more likely to assume that this house wasn't built until 1912, when all 4 lots would have come under common ownership at finally, and not having been divided. But what does seem clear is Scranton who was a very savvy real estate investor, both in Chicago and in Lake Bluff, it seems very unlikely he would have bought a lot encumbered by someone else's house that he couldn't use. It also seems very unlikely that that purchase would have been approved. Glenn kind of addressed the issue with closed brick, so I'll skip through that. But the question of whether it's closed brick or not becomes much more questionable when you take the idea that Ben Close built this house out of the equation, which I think would be highly unlikely given the likely date that it was built, or the likely date before which it could not have been built. I'm going to skip a couple of these things because I think Glenn, and I'm trying not to shoot this in anyone's eyes here, Glenn covered quite a bit of information already. So in the application, and we dispute that the house was, the application says the house was constructed by the Close family and owned by the Close family. We dispute that through the research that Ellen has done. It's also noted that if this were a Close house, it's one of 2 remaining Close houses, and references made to 666 Maple. I'd like to point out that if 666 Maple is a Close house, and I have no reason to doubt that, it is not landmarked, and it is not landmarked at the request of the owners. The land underneath this site certainly was Close at one time. A portion of the site was Scranton at one time. However, that describes probably 3/4 or more of East Lake Bluff, and I don't know that that alone qualifies it for landmark status. The application kind of repeats a lot of assertions at different times, so I don't keep repeating the same thing. I may seem like I'm jumping around a little bit, and I'll try and get back to a summary. But I'm going to skip the L form, and I'm not sure which L form we were referring to, but we'll talk about that when we're looking at the site. So I'd like to take up the large lawn in the application. Corner location subject property across from the former site of the Tabernacle, diagonally across from the site of the former and part of the 25 association lots, make an established visual feature. Commission members have noted its large front and side yards similar to the home immediately across from it at 501 East Prospect and the home diagonally across from it at 502 East Prospect. Familiar visual feature of the subject property, especially notable during the Lake Bluff 4th of July parade, which passes immediately in front of the subject property. So, in my opinion, through that you are attempting to landmark a lawn. There's no known event of significance that ever occurred on that lawn. Just as we know Lincoln didn't sleep in the house, we know the Battle of Gettysburg was not fought on the lawn. The setbacks, you establish that the setbacks are to be in context with 501 and 502. The point we'd like to bring out here is that The zoning ordinance itself will limit anything that we could build to within 5 or 7 feet, actually 5 feet here and 7 feet here, of the setbacks that are established by those two homes that are 100 feet away. While emphasizing those two homes, you don't regard the fact that, the setback as required by zoning will require us to leave a larger front lawn than any of our neighbors, any of the neighbors on the north side of the 400 block, and frankly, as you go east from these two houses and east from 501, we still will have a larger lawn than anything identified in the area. The side yards, which would be a distance from our setback or building line to the curb, because there's no sidewalk on this side, were exactly the same, despite maybe graphic, what it looks visually. The dimension is exactly the same from our setback to the face of 501, and our setback is larger than that respected by 502, just by the fact that their garage goes across it. So while emphasizing the context of two homes that are 100 feet away, you do turn and talk about the uniqueness of the yards. I'm going to try and jump to that. And the relation of the yard to the 4th of July parade. So restricting development rights for a once-a-year event would, to me, be a unique method of taking property. It also, having owned this house for 2 4th of July parades, having had our own parties at the 4th of July parades, the residents of Lake Bluff are very respectful of private property. They line the right-of-ways, in this case, to the right of the sidewalk. In the case of our neighbors across the street, close to the curb, same with up here, and they don't go onto people's lawns. There is no use to the public for holding out our lawn for any kind of public use. So they do stay, but in this case, you are saying our lawn is so important to the image of the 4th of July parade. However, at the same time, you allow an enclosure of a public right-of-way, preventing any public from watching the parade from along 502. I consider that a hugely dissimilar treatment of the two properties. All right. So in the application, you state, because of the connection to the closed family and its likely construction from closed bricks, and because of its location close to both the Tabernacle and the Hotel Irving, it is likely to yield historically significant information. Again, as we've discussed, it's not a closed family structure. It was separated from the Tabernacle by a hotel on the opposite corner. And I fail to understand how it's going to yield historically significant information. We've all done the record checks to the greatest extent possible. So the only significant information that could be gained from this would be through an archaeological site, which would be a demolition process. So moving on to architectural significance. You restate the side yards. I think we've tried to talk about that. So the architectural style of the original building on site, L form with Gothic and Italianate characteristics, has undergone little or no alteration. The L form is an alteration in and of itself. The original structure was this rectangle. I'm interpreting when you guys say L form that you're talking about this leg. The original addition, or the first addition here, would have made a T. I think I've got a better shot of this here coming up. Here we go. So this is the original form. This is addition 1 probably addition 2. The garage then would have been addition 3, and this was, infill was done in the 1960s. So the original building has been substantially modified in several ways. First of all, we wouldn't be having this debate about whether it's built by closed brick or not, except for the fact that it was stuccoed over at some point in its history. The stucco is not original, and that can be shown by its relation to the windows. You'd have to actually come up to the house to see it. But the sills, the heads, the jambs do not extend beyond the stucco. So they would have extended beyond the original face brick. The stucco has been added and essentially brought that out more or less flush with the window casings. So the stucco is an alteration in and of itself. Then the additions, which you claim the L form is significant and the L form is original, the L form is a significant alteration to the actual original structure, the actual structure that is old.
Bob, if I can
Yes.
jump in for just one sec, I actually, I have a photo to your stucco point, if that would help illustrate.
Go.
So this was far oblique from
Yeah.
that front surface.
So you can kind of see, there you go, how that comes up flush with the jambs. And can you scoot up a little bit? Does it go up at all? There we go. And the window heads right there. There's no relief between that stucco or pressure between the limestone lintel and the stucco, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. I think I had comments about the Italianate and Gothic, but I think Glenn addressed those and addressed those in a fair-minded fashion. The major point that we're trying to make here is the stucco itself is a major alteration. The additions to the house are a major alteration to the disservice of the original building. And that if I'm interpreting your petition correctly, the L form is the form of the overall campus here. That hardly, in my mind, qualifies it as a unique architectural element. Indeed, I think under any other normal circumstances, and clearly these structures don't comply with the Italianate or Gothic structure. I think under any normal circumstances, given the condition of these additions, the village would be actually asking us to remove them. I also find it ironic to be talking about an L-shape, the uniqueness of the L-shaped structure when its twin is sitting next door. Now, it is referencing the 1998 report that this house was built in 2002, I believe. So, let me jump to your summary if I can. So historic significance, the structure, building, site, or landscape is an exceptional example of historic or vernacular style. Is one of the few such remaining properties in the village. I think the significance of the original house is highly debatable. However, the additions only detract from the original and have no architectural value. They are major alterations with no architectural coherence or intent. The lawn does not have historical relevance. Zoning requirements combined with the existing right-of-way will limit anything we can build to be in kind with what's in the neighborhood. B, the structure, building, site, or landscape has a strong association with the life or activities of a person or persons significantly contributed to participation in historic or cultural events. In our opinion, and I think Ellen demonstrated through the historical record search, the association with Close is only through Close having owned half of East Lake Bluff Likewise, the association with Scranton is only as a landowner. Jeffries has no history, or there's no evidence of Jeffries ever having even actually lived in the village and was a land speculator. The association with the camp, yes, it's on a lot that was originally demised by the camp. Again, that would describe most of East Lake Bluff. If your intent is to landmark East Lake Bluff, then that would be your rationale. Otherwise, the house most likely postdates the camp, and the house is not typical both in siting and in construction of a camp home. The camp homes were frame and they fit on a 25-foot lot. This house is neither. The original house, and the rest of it is just later additions that were glommed on. So in our opinion, none of the criteria as laid out in the application have been met. I'm happy to take any questions, or if you want to go to public comment first, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
Questions first from the commissioners? We may. Go.
You mentioned just a second ago, just very briefly, I want to make sure I understood, you said that Jeffries was a land speculator.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that he was a minister for the Methodist congregation.
In Iowa, and to my understanding as a Catholic, Methodist ministers do not take vows of poverty. He bought 3 lots, and he ultimately bailed on 2 of them after the camp had closed, and there wasn't a financial incentive to hang on to them.
The Methodist ministers in this town have a long history of poverty.
He's not a minister, and he was not a minister at any time in this town.
My understanding is that it was, so
I think even in your application, it talks about him being a minister in Iowa.
that's fine, thank you.
I was going to say, in the deeds, so in the 1882 purchase, his record of he was in Iowa, and then in 1887, if I'm getting that right, the 2 different transactions both put him in Iowa for the purchase. Okay.
Good, thank you.
I believe he was connected, he knew Reverend King, who was part of, one of the founders of the Camp Meeting Association.
Okay.
Well, what was proved is he attended a conference with Reverend King. That's what's asserted in the application, not that they were friends. He may have been, there's no way to know either way, but what's asserted is that he attended the conference, the Methodist conference.
Something that I meant to mention is that the report, the application states that the front door faces east towards the tabernacle. It's contradictory because in the report it also says that the home was built in 1870 or before the sale of the land from Close, and the tabernacle hadn't even been built until 77. So that's something that's inaccurate in the report as well.
Yes.
Other questions?
I gotta say, I'm very impressed with what we've heard, and what it brings to mind to me is there's a lot of semi-myth that goes on when we talk about things. You know, the notion that when we get back to the thing at hand, the property is an unfortunate spot, which makes it very difficult to work around it, I think, even though I believe you and your architect tried to do that, to incorporate the existing house into some scheme. To me, the whole notion of the brick is somewhat irrelevant. It's inside, it's under the stucco. I've probably got closed brick holding up, I've got yellow brick piers in a part of my crawl space, and that means nothing to me other than I've knocked some of them down and replaced them with steel. So that's there.
So you took the missing brick, right? 'Cause you
I've
were
got the missing
one?
brick. I probably got 300
Missing
of
one in
them.
your chimney.
I made a mistake of throwing some of them into my cistern. And I agree with the notion of the lawn is, I used to sit on that lawn with Skip and Jan Swan. when they lived in that house and watched the parade go by. But that certainly is not a reason to encumber an owner, which is what this is. I feel very uncomfortable with with where this was heading.
Okay.
And I
Well,
think some of the facts are not necessary, so, you know, a lot of it's supposition now.
Yeah.
And
So
what I'm hearing tonight is
I'd
not
like to get
supposition.
any other comment from, you can
Could
respond
I
and then
make
I'd
a
like other comment.
quick response? Commissioner Hunter, you're correct. We were and we still are trying to find a way to incorporate the original brick structure. What Glenn showed in his photographs, and you know, you kind of have to get in there to really see it, is just that we are really dealing with an unknown condition that we can't truly determine until we tear out that first floor. If it's just a plate that's rotted out, you can rebuild that, you can reframe it. You know, that's not, it's a lot of work, but it's not huge. If we're dealing with the masonry foundation that, you know, is subsiding or collapsing, and there's an awful lot of moisture in that area, that obviously is a much different situation to deal with. And we just can't tell until we tear that floor out.
Thank you. We might ask some other questions. Are there other members of the audience that would like to address? Come to them.
Thank you. And I do have to say, I'm thrilled to come back to an HPC meeting and hear about landmarking and having people decide that they would like to have their houses landmarked. It's no longer a demolition commission, which is what I called it for many years. But I do just want to comment on the last presentation. As you know, Lake Bluff history, there's a lot of lore and there's a lot of fact, and they get confused. And we read Elmer's book. Elmer wrote that book, I think, about 1985. And it was the first time that anyone had really tried to lay out the history of Lake Bluff. He didn't have the advantages that we have today. No computer, no way to really get into it and look up. So he sent his secretary or his wife up to the county building and had her find out some of this. And if you read it, you'll find that it's pretty iffy. And that's what I think you're hearing about this particular house. It's pretty iffy. I mean, it's been there a long time. It definitely is something that you see. I mean, everyone says, you know, oh, that's the house at the corner of Moffett and Prospect. And you say, yes, that's the one with the big yard. So it's a well-known visual piece. There has been nothing exciting about that house brought forward. There were multiple brickyards all along this end of the lake. Mrs. Close operated hers. There was a guy just a little bit farther north. He had one. There were several in Waukegan. So bricks were not difficult to come by. And we'd like to think that we know what Close brick was, but I think we really don't know. The other thing, Ben Close inherited his father's property. His father died in Sacramento when he went to look for gold. And Ben inherited the property and then continued to buy property in Lake Bluff. So that at one point, Ben was available to sell you property, and he sold property to the camp meeting guys and to anyone else. The camp meeting ministers were well-intended. They wanted to have a camp meeting. They were Methodist, had nice backgrounds and everything, but they were in the real estate business. And they bought the land for the camp meeting and the tabernacle. They sold the lots around the tabernacle. They were cottage lots and tent lots. So there actually was a double row. You could have a house here and a house right behind it, and then the tabernacle. And so there were lots of lots there. Fortunately, they didn't overbuild. And then he also owned lots around town. So whether this was Ben Close's property, it doesn't mean he had a house there. He did live in Lake Bluff, and I need to look up what his address was. But Ben and his wife had 2 children, and they lived there. Ben and his wife finally found a ranch out in the west, and we have a really interesting letter from his wife that talks about their trip to San Francisco in 1912. They arrived as the earthquake did that day, and she writes out her experiences during the earthquake. But it's an interesting family, it's an interesting history, but don't try too hard until you get to up to the county and really look up who owns what and who sold what. And some of those records are still in McHenry because Lake County didn't exist. McHenry was the first county. So some of those records are still in McHenry. Thank you.
Thank you. Other members of the audience? Yes, sir.
So my name is Ed Wynn, and I live at 502 East Prospect. And I prepared, as you know, the draft that we're discussing about for the nomination. So I think let's clear up some things that I think we can agree on, and then let's talk about the things we don't, and the things we know, and the things we don't know. I think that's the most helpful way to go about this. So in no particular order, first of all, I agree with Mr. Helley that L form, I don't think is referring to the garage and the family room addition in the back. When you go and look at the 1998 survey and you look at the description of that home as being L form and how they describe it in that particular survey, it's referring to that adjacent structure to the west that mimicked but did not duplicate the original part of the structure. So I don't think that was what the survey was referring to, and it certainly wasn't what I was referring to in that document. I think we do know a few other things. So again, a lot of speculation about different things. I'm one that looks at the facts. So here are the facts that we know. We know the house was built 1870 according to the Lake County records. And we know that that was at the time that Bose owned that land before he transferred it to Jeffries. So we do know that from the factual information in the deeds. I would agree that it's sometimes hard to tell, But when I have trouble deciding what various points are, I look at the facts. And so what I did in my research, and I know people can research different things and draw different conclusions, is you go back to the actual deeds. I think we have to assume that the deeds are accurate. They were signed with notaries notarizing the signatures. So I think we have to rely on what do the deeds tell us. I think that's important. I also think that if you look at the other transfers of deeds, the fact that it said Iowa, that just says where he was from at the time he purchased the lot. So if you looked at the history of either some of the other homes we've looked at, it would say they lived in a different state or of Chicago and the like. So that's not determinative. The other thing that we know is that it does feature, as Glenn pointed out in the presentation, very strong characteristics of the Italianate, and I apologize, last time I pronounced that wrong, I won't do that again, and the Gothic style. And it's very similar, as I believe we pointed out, to 666 Maple. So it is very similar to that type of structure, and it is from 1870. What else do we know? We know that the lot is associated with Scranton. We know it's associated with Jeffries. Yes, Jeffries is a minister. I don't think there's any evidence about him being a land speculator. And in fact, as you'll recall from the petition, there is a site to actually seeing him listed as a minister in the town in Iowa, whose name I'm going to forget right now, where Cornell University is. The association to King is therefore very strong. King was the longtime president of Cornell, it's not University College, Cornell College in Iowa, and that's likely, can't prove it, but that's likely based on, that's how he became associated with Lake Bluff, so that we know that as well. A couple things that I want to say are not relevant, and I want to do this respectfully. First of all, the condition of the house really has no bearing on whether it meets the criteria in the code. It's unfortunate that the home has not been maintained as well as it should have been, but there are many other examples of homes in Lake Bluff that may not have been maintained as well, but that still have historical significance. One example would be the Frank Lloyd Wright home further down the street on Prospect. I would also say that this is really not about taking any property from an owner. I know that that's contentious, but I will say this. The result of this landmark designation is nothing more than to say that the home has historic significance and to trigger the advisory review that this commission has to try to, and it's successfully done on a few occasions, to either try to see if the home can be saved or to see if it's going to be torn down, can it be replaced with something that is similar in character to what's there, as well as what is similar to character in the neighborhood. And an example of that would be the home on Center that I had in a presentation several meetings ago. So that's the purpose of advisory review. This is not about saying Mr. Hulley and his family can never build a house on there. It's not saying we're taking any of the lots, none of those things. The other thing, going back to, I would say, here's the other thing we know, and I don't think there's even a reasonable dispute about it. There never was a house on lots 1 or 2. I think we can agree on that as well. As to whether the house went on 4 or went on 3, I'm pretty confident, but I can't say it for a certainty, but you can't say the opposite for a certainty either, that those land boundaries were very close, whether it went on by a foot or not by a foot, because in fact the retaining wall, and I think this is correct, Jenny, your retaining wall on your house at 415 in fact does go over into 419 at some point. So they weren't particularly careful about that, but if you look at the purchase price again, you can see that the purchase price would assume that there was a house there. The records that we have from Lake County say the house was there at 1870. So those are significant, I think, as well. The other thing I would point out is that the criteria in the code, and I think I pointed this out in an earlier presentation, the criteria are met as to the structure, building, site, or landscape. So I think the building, I still believe that structure, the original part of that structure, has historical significance, and it's associated with people in the village who are significant as well, but the site is as well. And one of the aspects of the site, and again, we're not talking about anybody taking away property from anyone, but one of the things about the site is that the lots 1 and 2 have for 100 or more than 100 years remained vacant, and that is a visual point of interest in the village, and I think we agree on that. So again, there are different opinions about this, but I think when we go from looking at what are the facts, I think the facts strongly support designation of this home as a landmark. I also recognize that one of the issues is Mr. Helly didn't designate this as, or nominate this as a landmark. This commission did. And I understand and appreciate that, but again, as we talked about in the last meeting, there are two different types of designations. One is the landmark designation, which allows the advisory review. The other one is the landmark certification, which would require approval of this body. That latter one would require, I absolutely agree with this, would require Mr. Helly to nominate the house. It's only the owner that can do that. In this case, the commission can, as it has, nominate that property. Again, I would ask the commission to look at what are the facts that we know that are true based on the records that have been presented, the evidence that's been put in. I agree with Ms. Nelson. A lot of lore, a lot of things that can be said, but go back to what are the original documents, what do they tell you, and what does that say about the significance of this house? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the audience wish to make a statement? Okay. So the commission now needs to make a decision. Before, I think I'll open it up for comments before we go through, and Paul is going to go through the criteria. I'm going to open it up for statements, and contrary to my normal policy, I want to make a statement first. And I'd like each of you to think about this and comment on it as we go around the room. I think our consideration should be only the original structure as identified. Can you put up one of your maps up there? I think it was the whatever that color is that's above the purple, whatever you call that. But I think that our conversation around landmarking should be only the originally identified structure and not any of the additions. So as you make comments, I'd like you to, your comments, I'd like you to think about that and give your opinion on that as well. So in no particular order, and no, you don't all have to talk if you don't want to, but if there are comments or questions, I appreciate hearing from them.
Chairman, there was one thing I forgot.
Come on.
And again, if I'm wrong about this, I'll stand corrected. So when we looked at that, and when the picture was put up about the stucco and it coming away from the windows, Glenn, do you know, was that on the original portion of the house, or was that on the portion that was the west addition?
This is on the original portion of the house. The west addition is behind this and to the left.
Okay.
From this perspective.
Okay, and can you explain again what that is that you observed?
This was just one of a series of photos I took on the site earlier this morning as part of creating this.
And
so it
again,
wasn't in my original presentation, but it was relevant to something Mr. Helly was saying.
And again, it looks to me, and again, I'm not an architect or anything else, but it does look like that stucco may be very similar to what we did with, what the commission did with Jenny's house earlier today. It could have been added on to that as well, but I don't think there's any proof, quite frankly, that that stucco keeps that house from being in its original state. I think it's just, again, one of those unknowns.
Thank you. Ben, if you could comment, since my suggestion is that we, in effect, modify our own application so that we look only at the original structure and not at any of the additions in terms of landmarking. Could you comment on the notice that was given and if this is an appropriate action that this commission could take?
Yeah, so I think in the code, I mean, let's start there with the code, that it's, you can recommend a structure, building, site, or landscape for designation as a landmark. It doesn't say, you know, the inclusion of the word structure indicates that it can be something less than an entire building. I don't think that that is a problem. You could also designate the entire building, you know, and if you so desire. Something less of a totality is not prohibited by the code.
And is not prohibited by the notice that was given for this public hearing.
No.
Okay. So we can do that. So I guess I'd like your thoughts on, let's do that first. What do you think of thinking about only the original structure as we go through landmarking?
Yeah, I'll go first.
We'll go around this way then.
Okay. Mr. Nguyen has pointed out a couple of points that I'd like to address. One of the telling points is that one of the points he just made just a minute ago was that we have no evidence of a house being, any sort of structure being built on lots 1 or 2. So if we look back to the house we just nominated for 400 Ravine and conceptualize what this block looked like well over 100 years ago, with the house at 400 Ravine, which is owned by the village president, and he owns half of the block. And then you have this house sitting on lots 3 and 4, or in this particular iteration, lot 3, and then have lots 1 and 2 vacant in front of it. You have quite a park-like situation here, where the entire block is an open part of Lake Bluff. It's a type of Lake Bluff that we haven't seen here in Lake Bluff in 50 or 60 years, but just a wide open part of town. And I think that this represents a part of that vista, or that element of the village from that time period. And so I think this becomes, while I don't think we want to landmark the lawn for the sake of the lawn, I think the vista and the setting of the property becomes important. So we're not trying to landmark the property because it's a great lawn to have 4th of Julys on. And I have to admit that when I was growing up in the 1960s, I had 4th of July parties on that lawn also. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the historical texture and feel of Old Lake Bluff. And if the Cochran and Fred Cornish property, which is Nan Caldwell's property, owns half of that block and it's all open and theoretically all full of oak trees, then this lot, sitting on its 4 lots, becomes the matching counterpoint to that and creates this beautiful vista of a wide open Lake Bluff, stretching into the ravine on one side, the tabernacle or the remains of the tabernacle on the other side. So that, to me, is a whole conceptual part of Lake Bluff that I'm interested in. As far as the stucco goes, one thing we know about stucco as a building material is that it's a semi-porous cement material. And once you stucco a house, you have to keep up with it. You have to keep repairing it, and you either lime wash it, or you heavily paint it, or in some cases, you re-stucco the house. So the fact that the stucco now, especially on the 2nd floor, comes all the way out to the window frames, to me, isn't necessarily significant. It may be just simply a sign of earlier repair work that's done without having taken down the older stucco. So those are a couple of the things that I see about this property in relation to some of the comments that were made. The things that intrigue me about this house are the really wonderful review that Glenn did in going through and talking about the architecture of the house. The house fits into its bracket as being an Italianate revival house. It has the window frames, it has the tall windows, it has the lovely eaves that overhang the house. This is a house that just screams 1870s or 1880s. If it's built after that, it's built by somebody who has got such a sense of retro architectural taste that they're building last year's model. They're building something that's, that they're building their grandfather's house. There may be questions about when the house was built. I think there's a pretty good argument that it does come from the 1870s just by looking at the architecture of the house. And I think some of the pictures that we saw of what's underneath the house, the pictures that Glenn showed, show that there's an awful lot of ancient structure that's under there, which to me indicates that it is a house of this age and era. But I'm very interested in a house that has this particular look and structural feel to it. I think having an Italianate house of this time period in Lake Bluff is very important. And so I may make some comments later on after you folks make comments, but I just wanted to sort of put those comments out there to start with. And Glenn, thank you for the presentation you put on. I thought that was superb.
I will take that as a great honor from you, Mr. Bergman.
I'm going to agree with and disagree with almost everything I've heard. So I feel compelled that the 1870 date, whatever the date says, doesn't make sense with the timeline that we saw on who bought the property and when. But in a way, I'm not sure that matters. What really becomes relevant, your notion about the open space, if the owner continues to pursue doing something on that property, other than trying to cram into the little house, that open space will disappear one way or the other. So it's a memory and not a fact.
Well, that's what we
as
talked
all
about.
of Lake Bluff is.
That's what we talked about months ago when the Helleys made their first presentation.
Yeah, and I think
which I was in favor of.
yeah, and maybe they'll still get something to work there. My biggest problem, and this has got nothing to do with the house or anything, is I totally object to anybody but an owner putting forward their residence for what we're doing. Landmarking. That is something I objected to when the ordinance was written, and I will continue to object to it. So I will never be able to vote for something that requires that to happen. So
Janie?
Well, I would like to go back to Bob's earlier comments. I think the Helleys did an amazing job of researching this and finding whatever documentation was available to be found. I also agree with Mrs. Nelson that the conclusions to be drawn from that could go in any number of different directions, whether the house was originally stucco or not, whether it was built in the 1870s or sometime after 1912. I don't think we'll ever know. We'll never be able to answer that question. And after hearing you put doubts in my mind as to how old that house really is and what relationship it had to early Lake Bluff, I have to say that I'm maybe not as committed as I was to preserving the house. As much as I feel badly about saying that on this commission, I think that we should not deal in the realm of what we would like to have been true, but what we can prove to be true. And I don't think we can prove any of this. We really don't know. It's certainly a house that everybody knows in town, and I think as in some other cases where we've taken some houses down, what's gone up in their place, if it has any sort of a nod to what was originally there, which sounds like maybe you're going to try and do, it could be an improvement. I really don't have a crystal ball that goes either forward or backward to tell you that, but I for one am not as gung-ho to preserve this property as I was when it first came before us, so.
Lois?
Well, as others, I feel conflicted because we've heard some very definite information about that it was sold at such and such date with a house president or that it wasn't. And I think that we're all very interested to have the history of the home very tied to Ben Close and perhaps the Close brick, which was gave it some, I don't know, credence and an interesting history. That aside, we've really looked at landmarking homes that don't necessarily have a real strong connection to historic figures in the town, but maybe more connected to the fact that there was a Lake Bluff Camp Meeting Association area. Putting the Ben Close and the Ben Close brick aside, I still think that the house has a lot of architectural interest. It has been stuccoed over, but yet that stucco didn't obscure the wonderful detailing of the windows and the doors and the entire structure. It's been real interesting for me once I started to become interested in this house to walk by 666 and just see the similarities in those two houses. I think that that's very unique, how similar those two homes are. And it does have a long history in the community. It's very much a recognizable home in the community. So those are some of my thoughts about the importance of still preserving some of the architectural homes in the community.
Sure.
So I, as everyone else, can agree with both sides of what everybody is saying. I really appreciate the work that you all did and bringing the points that you brought, as well as everybody else who's done work on this. Being a commissioner here means that we have a strong feeling about the history of Lake Bluff. We wouldn't be here otherwise. But there are other parts of what we do that are really challenging, and this is one of those situations. So I can agree with Steve that if we did do anything, I would think that it would be just the original structure. I can agree with that. I also think that all of the work that everyone did here shows why we do this. I think it's really important that we have an ability to capture all of this information, the parts that are actual facts, the parts that we can surmise are facts, and save it somewhere. That's why we're here. There are houses that we have agreed to demolish because many reasons of the structural things that you have happening in your home. I've said many times before, I lived in one of those camp meeting houses. The brick in my basement was held up with some tree branches and other things that, not necessarily structurally sound. That's challenging.
It was done back
So, I'm torn like everyone else. I'm not as gung-ho, like Janie said, as I was in the beginning. I see things that we didn't see before. So the one thing I can agree on is the original structure at this point in time, if that's.
Okay. Randall?
I'm in favor of saving what we can save in Lake Forest here.
Where?
Like Bluff.
Oh, Lake Bluff.
That too.
No, but I'm in favor of what?
Okay, thank you. We have to get, thank you, Sherry, for answering the question I ask all of you to comment on. But before I go back and ask about that, my own thoughts. Those of you that were here last month or have looked at the minutes, recognize that I'm not in favor, as a matter of principle, of involuntary landmarking of structures. And I actually voted against the petition or the ordinance last month to go through with this process. I said at the time that if the commission would approve, then when we did get to look at a landmark, I would look at the landmark on the basis of its merits, not on the basis of the mode in which the landmark reached our desks. So that's where my position is on involuntary landmarking and on the process that we're undertaking. What are we looking at here? Just the original structure or something different?
Original structure.
Original
Yes,
structure?
yes.
Yes.
Okay. So when we do take a motion, we will need to recognize that we're looking only at the original structure that has been presented as part of our, as part of the application. Paul, I'd ask you to take us through the landmark designation criteria. Given, again, as we consider these, we need to remember that we're now thinking about only the existing structure.
Can I ask you before you do that, Steve? I'm
Absolutely.
just thinking if I was sitting in the audience, I might be thinking, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean for the rest of the building, and what does it mean if we just do that?
Sure. From a practical perspective, if the landmark application would be approved by the village board, we're an advisory body, so whatever we do goes to the village board for approval. And if only the existing structure it receives the landmark criteria, that would mean that any future alterations or demolition or any significant alterations to the original structure would require an advisory review with this body. So that would mean that the additions could be demolished. They would, if they're 50 years or older, we would have to deal with that particular issue, but they certainly wouldn't be part of the landmark structure that would be established. It would only be the original structure. Okay?
Wow. So if we landmark the original part of the house, and the Hellies come back and say they want to tear down the garage and tear down the addition right behind the garage, that gets them over the 50% bump, right? Just eyeballing it. So they could end up back here just by virtue of wanting to just remodel the other parts of their house. So that ends up, okay.
But in terms of what the importance of what we'd be considering is preserving, to the degree possible, the existing structure, the original historic structure. Okay.
All right.
All right, so the process we're going to go through, as we did with the other two, is identify the landmark designation criteria that we believe, if we should so agree, that this would be included in the ordinance to be recommended to the village board. So Paul, do you want to take us through each one?
Okay. I apologize, I have had a cold all week, so if I start coughing in the middle of this, I'll try not to become too disruptive. So, starting with landmark designation criteria, general conditions. The structure, building, site, or landscape has significant character, interest, or value as part of the historic, aesthetic, cultural, or architectural characteristics of the village. It also includes state of Illinois and whatnot, but I'll just simply say the village. So, do we have significant character in historic and aesthetic and cultural and architectural characteristics of the village?
Well, I think yes, and I think it's for all of them. So circle structure, building, site, landscape.
Yes.
So I think, well, all we need would be one. I think this particular property has all four.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is closely identified with a person or persons who significantly contributed to the development of the village. Yeah, it was my understanding that Jeffries was a minister in town here, and now I'm told that he's not, so I'm in a quandary with that.
That's a maybe. And maybe isn't on the criteria list.
Maybe is, yeah, maybe is not on the criteria list. Since we don't really know who built the house, and since they're, so the person or persons around the building of the house is unknown and probably wouldn't apply.
Okay.
The only thing I question is the site, since it was part of the Camp Meeting Association, it was part of the original plat for the camp meeting grounds. So I could.
It's certainly part of part of that community.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, part of that block structure.
So I could say yes if we limited it to the concept of site, but certainly not to, and I've challenged with that because it says a person or person who significantly contributed. Persons would have to mean the Camp Meeting Association founders. So it is a little bit of a stretch to do that.
Okay, I can agree to that. I think that's fine.
What are people comfortable with? You want to just wait and come back to this, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I
Or
think
no?
that one is, I think it's a no.
I do
I
too.
think it's a no.
I agree.
Okay.
Okay,
It's a no.
agreed?
All right.
The structure, building, site, or landscape involves the notable efforts of, or is the only known example of work by a master builder, architect, designer, architectural firm.
You don't have to talk anymore since we don't know who designed it, so we'll
So
save
we
your
don't know
voice.
that, so that ends up as a no. The unique location or singular physical characteristics of the structure, building, or landscape make it an established or familiar visual feature.
Yes.
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 More than just the 4th of July. The activities associated with the structure, building, site, or landscape make it a current or former focal point of reference in the village.
Let's say no. We don't.
No.
We don't know.
We don't
of
know.
any.
No?
Yeah. The structure, building is a type or associated with a use once common but now rare, or particularly fine or unique example of a utilitarian structure and possesses a high level of integrity or architectural significance.
No?
No.
I think architecturally it's a very interesting building. I don't know if it's a high level of integrity. The structure, building, site, or landscape is in an area that has yielded or is likely to yield historically significant information or even prehistoric data. So we are uncertain whether this has got camp meeting bones underneath it, or it has relationships to the camp meeting era, or the eras that come after that.
But it's possible it may yield that information if we
So
continue to.
we've said earlier, this is an aspirational item that's on the list. So are we in favor of it?
Let's say no.
I would say no.
I'm not.
Sorry, I'd say no.
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 Okay,
Say no.
I guess it's a no. Okay, moving on to landmark designation criteria, architectural significance.
Hey, Paul, you gonna be able to do this?
Let me,
I can read for a while if you like, Paul.
let me do this for a minute here.
All right.
The structure, building, site, or landscape represents certain distinguishing characteristics of architecture inherently valuable for the study of a time period, type of property, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials. And given Glenn's description of it as an Italianate house, I think that
Say yes
fits
to
into
that.
that.
Yep.
The structure, building, site, or landscape embodies elements of design, detail, material, or craftsmanship of exceptional quality.
Yep. Haven't seen that.
No.
I don't think there's anything exceptional about it. The structure, building, site, or landscape exemplifies a particular architectural style in terms of detail, material, and workmanship, which has resulted in little or no alteration to its original construction. And I think that's,
If we're talking about the
That's a
original
yes if
structure,
you
I
take
think
the
yes.
additions off.
yeah.
Yeah.
The structure, building, site, or landscape is one of the few remaining examples of a particular architectural style that has undergone little or no alteration since its original construction.
Same reasons.
It's just-
And here again, if we're
That's
drawing this,
redundant.
if we're drawing that box very
Yep.
tightly,
Yep.
okay, the structure, building site, or landscape is, or is part of a contiguous grouping that has a sense of cohesiveness expressed through a similarity of style, characteristics, time period, type of property, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials, and accents the architectural significance of an area.
I would say no.
I would also
I would
say
agree.
no.
Say no.
Certainly not part of a contiguous grouping
The,
kind.
the house is interesting, but it's different from all the rest of
And
them.
they're all different from each other down
Yeah.
there, so.
Okay. The detail, material, and workmanship of the structure, building site, or landscape can be valued in and of themselves as reflective of or similar to those of the majority of other visual elements in the area.
I don't think so.
No.
And Bob, I think you just answered that question just a moment ago. The landscape is significant in its own right as landscape architecture, not merely as a complementary setting for the structure or group of structures.
No.
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 And so, getting to the last group, the historic significance. The structure, building site, or landscape is an exceptional example of a historic or vernacular style, or is one of the few such remaining properties of its kind in the village. And here we're talking about this Italianate structure again,
Yes.
I
and
can
just
say
in the
yes.
box.
Yep.
The structure, building site, or landscape has a strong association with the life of activities of a person or persons who significantly contributed to or participated in the historic or cultural events of the village. And
We don't know
We
that.
don't know.
we don't
So
know that.
I would say no to that.
So, the structure, building site, or landscape is associated with an organization or group, whether formal or informal, from which persons have significantly contributed to or participated in the historic cultural events of the village. And here we get more right
That's-
smack in the camp meeting group.
Yes.
The structure, building site, or janitorial service, the structure, building site, or landscape is associated with a notable historic event.
No.
And I don't think so.
No.
No.
And the structure, building site, or landscape is associated with an antiquated use due to technological or social advances. No. The structure, building site, or landscape is a monument to or a cemetery of a historic person or persons.
Nope.
Nope.
No cemeteries there.
Okay. We've gone through the criteria. Any other questions or comments from the commissioners? We'll wait until this is done over here.
When is your house built?
Hmm?
When was your house built? Do you know?
What, 78?
Did you have a comment, Bob, or a question? No?
Yeah, well, what was it? Okay, if, the ramifications, if we elect to, make this a, why can't I think of the word?
Landmark.
Land market. Been doing this for 10 years. If we elect to do this landmarking, the ramifications of that relative to what's in here is a demolition permit. And so where does that stand? Are we going to start extending out timeframes to the extent that we have, I think, just extended them to start over again and add a year and so on and so forth?
So Ben, do you want to address that?
Yeah, so in terms of the timeframes, you will make a recommendation tonight. It sounds like was what you're going to want to do, one way or the other, whatever the vote may be, and then it goes to the village board. If it is landmarked, then the question becomes, what happens with the demolition permit? Now, the permit application has been submitted. So the next question then becomes is, does does the owner stand on that demolition permit application? Or is there a change where he submits a new demolition permit application depending on what his plans may be? And that would be in the owner's prerogative to decide what he would do. Now, if you have the current demolition application, and it is landmarked, this portion of it, the next question would be, it goes through advisory review in that process. If there's a new application that is submitted and his plans change, or he withdraws the demolition permit application, then we have another situation, which is we will take a look at whatever that new application is and have to do an assessment to decide, you know, what it may be. And we don't really know at the moment. You know, in terms, you know, of which portion he may or may not want to demolish and so forth.
Is it,
Do you have other thoughts, Drew?
well, let me just try to put it in different layman's terms. Does the demolition permit that is now in place, does it cease to be effective? Does it go away?
If you landmark?
Yeah.
It does not go away. I mean, we have an application on file, that is, you know, an owner's right.
Okay.
It does not go away.
It's held in abeyance?
In terms of,
If we-
if it's landmarked?
Yeah, if we landmark the property tonight, does the demolition permit go into abeyance? Does it go to?
Well, so it's a recommendation tonight, it then.
If the village board approves the
Village board
landmark.
approves, you know, it then triggers, at that point, you have a demolition permit that's been submitted on a landmarked property, and so it triggers the advisory review.
And the timeline starts over?
You're in the advisory review timeframe.
Correct.
So that's different than the 90-day period we're in right now. So understand that under our code, once you know, when a demolition permit is submitted, there's a 90-day period in which you have to, or the village has to accept nominations. Okay? So within that 90-day period, the village has received the nomination, and that's the one that you have made and that we're considering this evening. That's a different issue than a situation in which you have a landmark. So that 90-day period that we're in now, at this point, has ended because we have a nomination. So that's behind us. We're now focusing on the actual application, I would say the actual nomination.
So if we should decide tonight not to pursue landmark status, then what happens to the demolition process, demolition permit process?
So there's two parts to that. Number one is you can not make a recommendation tonight at all. You can continue if you'd like. You could take no action. If your recommendation is not to landmark, and that's your formal recommendation, it still goes to the village board, and it is up to them to review your recommendation, and then they will make their own assessment. So if you don't move, so if you make a negative recommendation, it doesn't, for lack of a better word, doesn't kill the nomination.
I see.
That
So
goes to the village
So the
board.
village board could still decide to landmark
Correct.
the house.
Correct. And the same thing is if you make a recommendation on the original portion of the house, the village board may look at it differently. I mean, they have the prerogative to say, no, we think it's the entire house, or we think it's the site. You know, you have a recommendation and it's only that. Now, if it goes to the village board and they decide on this nomination not to landmark, the 90-day period that we're in still runs, and theoretically another nomination could be submitted by any of the other nominating bodies. But again, the clock is ticking on the 90-day period, and unless that period's extended, which can happen once, that will end, and as soon as that ends, the demolition permit, as long as the application remains with the village and is not withdrawn, the village would then, at the end of that, issue the demolition permit. So I know it's a little complicated. I'm happy to go to answer any more questions about that timing.
Everybody clear? So again, let me try it. Layman's terms, very layman's terms. If this body recommends and the village board approves landmark status, then the house can't get torn down until there's an advisory review process that occurs. Is that, okay, so that's, I think, about as simple as we can make it. Okay, any other, yeah,
What I was also referring to is the potential of demolition delay that we have built into the ordinance.
yes?
And, you know, at what extent do we think, and we don't know. We don't know what the owner's plans are for the property. We don't know if they're gonna be able to incorporate the house or not. And what I don't wanna do is take on the punitive action of just extending it out as long as we can, just because. And I'd dearly love to see that thing stay. I mean, don't get me wrong, people, I think it's a neat little house, but it's in the wrong spot at the wrong time.
So let me try to answer that again in layman's terms, very basic, and correct me if I'm wrong. So if this body recommends and the village board approves the landmarking, then the house can't get torn down. So I'm not gonna get into what that does to the existing demolition permit, whether it's in abeyance or whether it goes away. But the house can't get torn down until there is, if the owner so chooses, to pursue an advisory review with this commission. And at that point, the intent of the owner would be known in terms of what they're proposing to do with the portion of that house that it would then be landmarked. So at that point, and in point of fact, the day after the landmark status would be approved, the property owner could decide that they want to continue and pursue a demolition that would trigger the review process. So we would go through that process, but at the end of that process, the property, the rights of the property owner they could do what they want to that property, as they always can. So there is the landmarking would create another block of time during which there would need to be, if there is actually a landmark process, there would need to be an advisory review with this body.
To add on to that, I mean, this body, this board controls demolition review. You can choose to extend it, you can choose to end it. And the same is true of advisory review. In that case, the village board extends it, but ultimately, at the end of the day, this board has a lot of control over, by how you vote and act together, over how this process looks, and certainly to the extent that that's not within the board's control, we'll consider how you want it to look, and reporting that to other responsible parties and how we look at our decisions.
Okay, everybody clear?
Right.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Not to further complicate the situation, but if the HPC recommends and the board approves landmarking on just the old house, as you guys are talking about, and so any demolition, clearly then any demolition of the old house is held up. What about the rest of the site?
And again, you guys can elaborate. If there would be, so if your decision would be to try to save the old house and remove the others, if those other structures, I believe, are 50 years or older, it would trigger that portion of the code. So yes, there would be a demolition review that would need to occur, in my view. I think it's fairly obvious what this commission, without putting words in our mouths, what this commission, since we would be landmarking only a particular portion of a property, I could guess what the outcome would be.
Sorry.
As far as if I'm thinking your question might be, if you pursue to build additional things on the property, expand out whatever you were going to do, what's the role of this commission then? Is that your question?
Well, it was both a timing question and then a process question, and you know, there's the structures that are ancillary to the main house. And then what would the process be to go forward? I mean, it seems like we are just delaying, you know, delaying the whole thing again. Yeah. I mean,
Yes, you can look at it that way. The other thing that happens in an advisory review, to the degree that the commission, the intent of the act and then the intent of this body is to work with the property owner to come up with a reasonable solution that works for everybody. I know of a number of cases where we have worked with other bodies, other advisory bodies within primarily the zoning board, to think about what is some alternatives that might be available to a property owner who wishes to preserve what is deemed to be historic and landmarked, and what can be done in terms of what else goes on that particular property. But that's another 3 steps ahead of us.
yeah, and we went down in flames on that process. Okay, thank you.
All right? Well, I was going to ask our attorney to then give us the potential changes, but since he's not here, I guess we'll take a break till he comes back. You certainly can.
I have a question about this committee.
Yeah.
Okay, so, the Historical Preservation Committee. And I heard last month that there were three bodies that could nominate a house for landmarking, right? The owner, the Historical Museum, and the Historical Preservation Committee.
And the village board. There are actually 4.
Oh, and the village board.
Yep.
Okay, I thought there were only 3. 4. Well, if you are empowered to do that and to propose a house for landmarking, don't you think it's strange that you would say, the 2 of you would say that you don't believe in that part of your job? That you don't believe in this committee's recommending for landmark over, I mean, if it disagrees with the owner?
The preferred method of landmarking is with the consent of the property owner.
Sure, but they
And
definitely.
The power to recommend or submit an application is in those 4 bodies, but individuals within all of those bodies have different viewpoints on process and different viewpoints on applicability. It's clear in the ordinance that no matter, the ordinance is the Historic Preservation Ordinance in Lake Bluff is based on the premise that the property owner always can do what they deem proper with their own property.
Right.
So that's the basis of it, and what we're really talking about
I understand
is,
that, but I
is
thought
encouragement.
I thought it was your job description to participate in that process if the owner didn't or couldn't.
Well, we are, right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So,
I wasn't intending to speak, so I'll swear in Stephanie Bjork, and I swear to tell the truth. I think a point of fact that needs to be brought up right now is that on the National Register listing for the downtown business district, the train station owner filed a letter of objection to that registration, and it was nominated despite the owner's objection by the board. So I think it's really important to point out that it has been done, and
There's a difference. That's a national landmark. This body didn't consider that at all. That never came before this body or the village. That's a separate and independent process.
but my point would be that if this goes forward to the village board for action,
Yeah.
that situation exists for them.
No, the village board did not have anything to do with the downtown historic district designation. That's the individual, there was an application that was submitted, but the village did not have anything to do with that application.
It was signed by the village board, I believe. I looked at it online.
Didn't you do it?
The,
Can I make a point about that that may clarify it?
Let's give Paul a chance to
okay.
think first.
So the National Historic Register District is a process that does not involve the village governing bodies at all, so that you can have a National Historic Register District with absolutely no input from the city or village in this case. So they can, the National Historic Register application process goes to, it's a convoluted trail, but it goes to state representatives down in Springfield who make a recommendation to the National Park Service. If the National Park Service agrees with the recommendation, they declare the property to be a National Historic Register district. They then inform the village that the National Park Service has created a National Historic Register district in the village. And so the village governing bodies, this body and the village trustees and everybody else, has no input into the process.
And I would say, if I could comment, that's my understanding. I think the more relevant precedent to look at, and I think, Glenn, it was in your memo last meeting, was that this board, considering a landmark designation, has on 5 to 7 occasions, if I can remember right, there was the list in your memo, has landmarked over the objection of the owner. So I think that's the relevant precedent. So it wouldn't be a case here that this would be the only or even the first time that that was done.
Let me, not to put words in your mouth or in our mouths, but rather than saying without the support, whatever you said, that the active, it was either, there were instances where the property owner was not the applicant, where the commission was the applicant, and it was either the property owner objected or the property owner was neutral. So, yeah, okay. Okay. Yes.
All right. So
Clarification?
Clarification.
Okay.
So, Mr. Helliott asked about the timing of the demolition permit in this, and if there is a landmarking of the original portion of the structure, and what happens to the rest. And I think the timing would work along this frame, and it's partly up to Mr. Helly in terms of if he were to withdraw his demolition permit application and submit a new one. But the village does have authority to issue a permit, call it what I will call a partial permit. Would be the same thing if you, let's say, applied for a building permit and you presented plans to the village, and we can look at it and say, this portion does not, for this portion of the property, does not meet, let's say, the building code. We will give you a permit for this part of your addition, but not this wing. And we could issue and put a condition on the building permit saying, we're issuing it, but you can do X, but you can't do Y. Here we have an active demolition permit application. So in the event that he does not withdraw it, we as the village, upon the landmarking, could issue a demolition permit for those portions that are not landmarked. And at which point, he would have a choice, but he would not be able to remove and demolish that original structure that's been landmarked until there's the advisory review period. Now, again, that said, I think the village reserves the right to look at the demolition application further, and obviously work with Mr. Helly in terms of what his plans are to make sure that, with the landmarking, to make sure that this is done properly. So I hope that helps.
It does, but when you say the village has the ability to decide about a partial demolition? Who is the village? Is it the village board? Is it the staff? Is it the attorney? Is it, it's not us.
It would not be this body. Instead, that the demolition permit, at that point is a ministerial function, and it's carried out by the building commissioner.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So, Ben, could you give us the amendments that would be necessary to the potential resolution?
Okay. So looking at the draft resolution before you, these would be the suggestions that I would recommend to it to capture what we've discussed prior. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the 8th whereas clause,
Could have said the last whereas clause.
is it the last? It is the last one, okay. The last whereas clause. I would rephrase it in this manner. Whereas after consideration of the evidence of the public hearing, the commission has determined that the portion of the nominated building depicted in Exhibit B, which we will define as original structure, and we recommend that we will attach as Exhibit B a depiction of the property outlining the original structure, meets the landmark designation criteria for the reasons stated in the minutes of the public hearing as follows. General consideration, section 1A, the nominated building, we would change nominated building, and we would do so throughout this whereas, to the original structure, has significant character, and so forth. The next amendment would be deleting the reference to section 1B. It would be deleting the reference to section 1G, deleting the reference to section 3B, and then in the operative clauses in section 1 and section 2, changing the reference to from nominated building to original structure.
Okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay. So with those changes to the proposed ordinance, I would entertain a motion to recommend that the village board landmark the original structure of the property located at 419 East Prospect Avenue.
I will make that motion.
Do we have a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Roll call vote, please.
Once again, the order is random. Vice Chair Hunter.
No.
Member Church.
Aye.
Member Bergman.
Yes.
Member Liebel.
Yes.
Member Richardson.
Yes.
Member Nickel.
Yes.
Chair Kraus.
Yes.
Motion carries.
By a vote of 6 to 1.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
A difficult vote.
I think the rest of our agenda will be taken care of very quickly. Agenda item number 8 is a continued discussion of the strategic plan and visioning. We are working towards a first quarter of 2019 Saturday public meeting, workshop meeting with the village board, and hopefully with invitations to ABR and PCCBA. We're still working through the process and the actual presentation for that meeting. Chairperson's report, I want to take a roll and see who's going to be here in November and December. If you're not going to be here in either, anyone not here in November?
What's the date again?
Give me one moment.
You going south?
No.
I have November 14th and December 12th.
So November 14th, anyone not here?
I said I wasn't going to be, but my meeting changed to the 7th, so I
So we'll
couldn't
all be here in November?
Maybe.
December?
Yes. Yes.
December? I won't be here in December. Bob, are you going to be here in December?
Probably,
Okay.
unfortunately.
So it's only me. Okay. Good. Staff report?
Again, to be clear, the two pending nominations from this board's September meeting will be on second reading at the village board's meeting on the 22nd. And then the three recommendations made tonight on the 10th will also be up for first reading on the 22nd. So 5 landmark nomination ordinances in total on one agenda.
Great.
I believe that concludes my report.
Anything else? Anything else from the commissioners? Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
9:50. Thank you very much.
Glenn, do you want to keep this stuff and shred it?
That's
or
our
whatever?
record, I think.
Sure, passing on over.